Hello evangelical friends, I am Dr. Frederick Mulder and welcome to Evangelical Platform, a YouTube channel dedicated to preserving the gospel in a complex, messy, postmodern world. I'm busy reciting an Afrikaans book I wrote in South Africa a couple of years ago, illustrating how evangelicals are often persecuted at state institutions. Today I'm going to recite chapter 2, but I'm going to tweak it slightly to try and make it more relevant for other denominations too. So recently, the Archbishop of Sydney, Glenn Davis, invited theological revisionists in Australia to start their own church, to separate from the Anglican Church in Australia due to same-sex marriage being approved in one of the provinces. So what I want to do is I want to try and explain to us today how it is possible that a church can move from a biblical view on, let's say, marriage or the resurrection of Jesus over time to a position where they adopt a radically different view. And what I want to do is I want to illustrate how this works by looking at how that developed in the Dutch Reformed Church, and also maybe give a challenge to the Archbishop and say, yes, you want them to separate and start their own church, but history has shown that they don't leave. What they usually do is they get a foot in the door, and then if they are not disciplined, they eventually occupy, and then what they do is they take over and become a militant force. So that's what I'm going to try and illustrate by looking how that happened in the Dutch Reformed Church, starting especially in the year 2000. I'm going to discuss 3 key moments, and then after that I will finish with a story from a student and then with a piece of scripture. So here we go. The first important moment, I think, was when the Dutch Reformed Church theological faculty and the Hervormde Kerk merged in the year 2000. And the reason that is crucial is because you had theological liberals who then started to teach Dutch Reformed students from the Hervormde Kerk. The most notorious and famous one, of course, was Professor Andries van Aarde. Now, he was my professor. By God's grace, I could work very hard in his classes. I got firsts in all my subjects with him. But he was notorious when he published this book in 2000 called Fatherless in Galilee. In this book, he argues a couple of very controversial things, like Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, Jesus fantasized about God and then the Father became his father, Mary could have been raped by a Roman soldier, although there is uncertainty about that. Jesus didn't arise bodily from the dead. He lived on in the preaching, almost like Bultmann. So a very controversial book by an ordained Hervormde Kerk scholar. And there was a huge debate in his church going on. Some more conservatives challenged him about the bodily resurrection. And the bottom line is he was never disciplined by the church or found guilty and asked not to teach students. So we had to sit in his classes. And I'm going to discuss in later chapters a number of examples where students got confused, and some of them even said they lost their faith. Now, that is, of course, a complicated thing to say, but they got disillusioned, depressed. Some students even, abandoned their studies. And Professor van Aarde's teaching played a huge role in some of that. Now, there were some who disagreed with him, who wrote counter articles against him in the newspapers, but that was as far as they went. There was not church discipline, and I think that was the crucial thing that became a huge problem in the church and caused serious divisions between Dutch Reformed Church and Hervormde theologians at the time. So I think this was the first major move away from a confessional understanding of doctrine and the authority of Scripture in the year 2000. Now, the second example is Dr. Ben de Tooy, who wrote this book, God, Geloof in 'n Postmoderne Tyd. In English, that is God, Faith in a Postmodern Time. And this book was published in 2000. He's a Dutch Reformed Church scholar. And in this book, he basically renounced the virgin birth, the existence of the devil, and then he tried in a fairly modernistic way to argue that death and resurrection of Jesus can be compared to energy that survives. So he was trying to reinterpret the gospel, and it caused a huge storm in South Africa. He visited Pretoria. I went as a first-year student to the book launch. The Master of Ceremony at UNISA, the university, was Professor Isaac Spannenberg, also another controversial scholar. I'll talk more about him in the next YouTube. And also, he was not disciplined by the church. And after the publication of this book, he was appointed in senior positions at the General Synod. He was in charge of all the electronic communication for the General Synod, and he was in charge of the Doctrine Committee for the Dutch Reformed Church, despite all these views. He was criticized. Other scholars wrote books as well. Senior professors said they disagree with him, but that is as far as they went. There was no church discipline. He was also a staunch supporter for LGBT rights, the same with Van Aarde earlier as well, and he drafted and crafted some reports, and there were even some dishonesty in 2007 with one of the reports where they sent it off to government, where they supported the government's position on marriage for homosexuals. At the time there was a controversy, and then he threatened to resign, but he used his position to his own advantage. So he was a notoriously controversial scholar, and on top of that, he received a famous theological prize in South Africa for this book. Now, the reason I have to unpack that is because it is quite remarkable that he received that prize. That prize goes back to this man, and this is Dr. Andrew Murray. Now, Dr. Andrew Murray is one of the most famous Dutch Reformed Church moderators in its history. They came from Scotland. He's a conservative. He wrote several books on prayer. He was moderator a couple of times. He wrote books against theological liberalism. This book he wrote where he supported the key doctrines of the church. And the prize is called the Andrew Murray Prize. And they gave it to Dr. Ben de Tooy for the book, where he basically thrashes all the doctrines that Andrew Murray preached and wrote about. The third one is the appointment of Professor Julian Miller as head of department in practical theology at the University of Pretoria. Now, the reason it is significant is in the year 2000, when he became head of department, he started to make controversial claims in the media. So he had one sermon that was published online about the Protestant Reformation, and at that time you had the Jesus Seminar in the United States that was quite popular, and you had some of those scholars who visited South Africa. One of them was Marcus Borg, and Professor Miller published a talk online where he made a case that it doesn't matter whether you believe the resurrection is a literal event or that it's a metaphorical event. And then he contrasts the Jesus Seminar with conservative Christians. He said that the most important issue is whether Jesus is Lord. So he basically wanted to say you can believe about the resurrection what you want. If you say Jesus is Lord, then you're part of the church. He also became a very staunch and influential LGBT supporter, and at the university he provided a research hub for students to engage in those issues, and a number of things I'm going to get in later chapters. But these three theological events, I believe, planted the seeds and gave the foot in the door to the progressives. And once they came in, they eventually occupied, they influenced some new appointments, and then they took over. And the battle, I believe, was lost because church discipline was not applied. The evangelicals thought that, we're the biggest block in the church, we'll be all right. The liberals, they will eventually die out or start a different church. But they did not do that. They stayed, and eventually they took over. So often, once the liberals get a foothold and then start to occupy, they become quite forceful and militant. And I want to illustrate it by reading for you a paragraph from an evangelical professor who explains what happens to many theology students who came to see him in his office when all of these new things were going on. This is what the professor said. Before me sits a third-year theology student. As he starts talking, I see his eyes swimming in tears. Professor, I want to talk to you. I am struggling with my faith. How can you still believe in Jesus? I cannot remember how many theology students have come to my office over the past 2 years with the same question. Later on, he starts sobbing unashamedly and says, Professor, I feel like a traitor. In my parents' home, I believe with my parents and I'm actively involved in my local congregation. But when I come to the university, many of the things I believe in are contemptuously dismissed in class. Suddenly, I think of what someone once told me. The theologians live with the money of believers, but they undermine the faith of the same believers. This statement, the professor goes on saying, is very harsh, but does it not contain an element of truth? But what do I answer the students who come to me with these questions? Well, I say to them, keep holding onto the faith that was already in your grandmother Louise and in your mother Eunice, and which I am convinced is also in you. That's, of course, Paul writing to Timothy. And then the professor says, academics definitely do not have the last word when it comes to religious matters. Now I want to finish to illustrate what happens when liberals in the church are not disciplined over time. It's a text from Luke chapter 11, where Jesus says in verse 17, any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a house divided against itself falls. Friends, there are issues that Christians can disagree on, but when it comes to the core doctrines of the Reformation, if we are going to tolerate the progressives, over time, history has demonstrated they take over. I want to challenge you and me that we will marry love and truth, but when it comes to the heart of the gospel, that we will be faithful to Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for watching today. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this, and you can forward it to friends. Have a good day. Goodbye.